So we've got a new Mac, a new display, and a new M1 Ultra chip. Apple's peak performance event delivered some pretty exciting new tech, especially if you're in the market for a powerful desktop Mac. And speaking of powerful desktop Macs, what can we learn about the Mac Pro from these releases and what Apple told us at the event? I've got some thoughts. Lots of my esteemed fellow YouTubers have already done detailed videos on the Mac Studio and Studio Display, so I'm not going to do a deep dive on those, but a quick recap might be helpful and also help you guys to understand my train of thought with this. Now first, Apple announced a new and final addition to the M1 family, the M1 Ultra. Basically, it's two M1 Max chips with a very clever and very fast interconnect between the chips. M1 Max is already a very large die, so making it even bigger is a challenging process. So what Apple did instead is connected two M1 Max dies with an interconnect that they call UltraFusion. It's got more than 10,000 signal paths and provides 2.5 terabytes per second of interprocessor bandwidth between those two chips. And Apple claimed that this is 4 times the performance of the leading competitor. Where the interconnect really makes a difference is how it enables the two separate chips to be presented to the system as one single system on chip. And this is pretty huge because it means that software developers don't need to do anything differently. If the two chips weren't connected in this way, software developers would have to specifically code support for them into their apps. And we've already seen how that doesn't really work. If you take your mind back to the 2013 Mac Pro, now that had 2 separate GPUs in it because Apple was betting on GPU computing becoming much more popular than it actually did. But the trash can Mac Pro was still a great machine, providing that software developers wrote their code to specifically support the architecture. And for the most part, they didn't. It's a lot of extra work for just one machine. And the end result is that most apps were never properly optimized for that dual GPU setup. And so the trash can Mac Pro spent most of its time working on just one of its GPUs. But thanks to that interconnect, this isn't going to happen with M1 Ultra. And that is some pretty big news. And we're also given a bit of a clue as to how Apple might approach the Mac Pro. And we'll get to that in a moment. The first machine to be shipped with M1 Ultra is the new Mac Studio. And it looks like they've stretched a Mac Mini. But actually it's the same footprint as the Mac Mini, and that in itself is perhaps an indicator that the Mac Mini won't be getting a design refresh anytime soon. But I do wonder if we'll see a Mac Mini with the M1 Pro chip in it. That's for another day. Let's get back to that Mac Studio. We've got I/O on the front of the computer, finally, thank you Apple. There's an SD card slot that supports fast UHS Type 2 cards, and there are 2 Type C ports. On the M1 Ultra version of the Mac Studio, these are Thunderbolt 4, but if you spec your Mac Studio with M1 Max, there'll be 10 gigabit USB ports. On the rear, we've got 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports and 2 USB Type A ports. Sadly, those are 5 gigabit USB ports, but we do get 10 gigabit Ethernet as standard. There's an HDMI port, which is not the latest spec, so it'll be 4K 60Hz resolution. But that's hardly an issue given all those Thunderbolt ports which we can use to drive high-resolution displays, like the new Mac Studio 27-inch 5K display. And Apple are very clear that the Mac Studio is targeted at creative professionals, video editors and colorists, photographers, 3D artists, audio professionals and developers. And I think that this machine in its various configurations will cater very nicely for a lot of these creative workflows. And I like the fact that you can spec the very capable M1 Max chip in your Mac Studio. And I can see that being more than enough for many working in the industries that we just mentioned. But the M1 Ultra essentially doubles those capabilities for those who have got much more demanding workflows. Perhaps, though, one of the biggest plus points is the energy consumption. Apple claimed the Mac Studio will use up to 1,000 kilowatt hours less electricity per year when compared to a similarly performing x86 workstation. And as someone who has a fully loaded PC workstation, I can well believe that. With current energy prices, that is going to factor into the purchase considerations for many creative studios. Imagine if you've got a studio with 10 workstations, that energy saving each year is going to be considerable. It seems also like Apple intend for the Mac Studio to take the place of the 27-inch iMac, which has now been discontinued. So does that mean that we won't see a large iMac released this year? I think it does. We'll talk about that in future videos, and we'll talk more about the Mac Studio in future videos. But for now, let's address the elephant in the room, or the lack of, that Big Mac Pro. Is there going to be a new Mac Pro if we've already got a powerful M1 Ultra desktop? And if there is, what specification might it have? To answer the first question, yes, there will be a new Mac Pro, and it will be released this year. How do we know that? Well, to quote John Turnus from the Apple event, he said that these new products make the transition to Apple Silicon nearly complete with just one more product to go, Mac Pro. Apple have also repeatedly said that they will complete this transition within 2 years, and they're timing that from the launch of the original M1 machines, which was November 2020. So if the transition has to be complete within 2 years, and the Mac Pro is considered to be the last part of that transition, then we can reasonably expect to see a Mac Pro later this year. What about the specification though? Will the new Mac Pro contain the much talked about M2 chip? I don't personally think so. I believe it will be based on M1 Max and M1 Ultra. To quote John Turnus again, he said, "We're adding one last chip to the M1 family." So the M1 Ultra is the last M1 chip. But if that's already in the Mac Studio, you might ask the question, doesn't the Mac Pro need to be more powerful? Doesn't it need something more? Not necessarily. But let's talk about M2 first. We can expect that M2, when it does arrive, will replace the standard M1 chip. And then we would expect to see an M2 Pro, Max and Ultra. It doesn't make sense to me that Apple would start production with the most challenging of those dies. Why would they start with an M2 Ultra? And I think we also need to think about the cores that the chip will be based on. M1 uses the Ice Storm and Firestorm CPU cores, and these cores are also found in the A14 Bionic. The A15 uses a newer generation of cores called Blizzard and Avalanche, but these don't represent a particularly big leap over the previous generation. So I wonder if maybe Apple will instead base the M2 chip on the next set of cores, the ones that are being prepared for use in the A16 Bionic chip. Apple, of course, isn't immune to the global supply chain issues, and they've already shown that they're keeping the number of different chip SKUs to a minimum by putting the M1 into the iPad, even though iPadOS can't fully utilize it, and by putting an A13 Bionic into that Studio display. And again, it won't be able to fully utilize that chip, but it's just much cheaper to use what's already in production rather than designing new specific chips. And it gets around some of these production capacity constraints that we currently see. So just keep that in mind. And also remember that Apple sells far more iPhones than it does Macs. So it does make sense to produce a new iPhone chip every year, but it probably makes more commercial sense for the M chip for the Macs to be on a 2-year cycle. Apple's release of the M1 Ultra wasn't a big surprise because schematics for a 2-die chip had already been leaked, and those who know about silicon design had already realized that Apple would have to take this sort of approach. But interestingly, we have also seen leaks for a quad-die product. In other words, 4 M1 Max dies connected together. So does John Turnus' statement indicate that that chip won't be coming? Well, if M1 Ultra is the last chip, then yes, there won't be a 4-die system on chip with an M1 name. But that doesn't mean that there won't be a Mac Pro with 4 M1 Max chips in it. Just think for a moment about what makes a Mac Pro Pro. And sure, Apple do play fast and loose with the Pro moniker, but what makes the Mac Pro a workstation? Is it that it offered better performance than consumer machines? Not always. That entry-level 8-core Xeon could be outperformed by the top 27-inch iMacs. Professionals buy workstations not just for performance. It's also about having things like error-checking memory, both in the system and the GPUs. If you have a very demanding workflow or you're running computations which take a long time to run, you want to have error-checking RAM to ensure reliability. Workstation-grade components are designed for longevity and reliability. Workstation GPUs have specific drivers which are certified to be compatible with leading software, and that's what workstation users are paying for, along with upgradability and configurability. Those things are important too. Professionals may want custom configurations of CPU, memory, multiple GPUs, storage drives, and PCI Express cards for specific interfacing with dedicated audio or video equipment. And you can't really do that with the new Mac Studio. And of course, the nature of M1 means that you're somewhat limited in your ability to customize, because each system on chip comes with its CPU, its GPU, and its memory in set combinations. So what could the new Mac Pro look like? Well, suppose Apple has come up with a socket interconnect, something that works as well as the UltraFusion die interconnect does. What if you could combine two systems on chip together in a Mac Pro system? And what if that was modular? So perhaps you could configure your Mac Pro with the same M1 Max and M1 Ultra configurations as we see in the Mac Studio, but then perhaps have an option to add in another one of those cards to increase performance. And this would allow for an interesting combination of configurations. You could have two M1 Max cards or two M1 Ultra cards for a total of 4 M1 Max SoCs. Maybe it would even be possible to mix and match those cards. The key here, though, is that interconnect allows the whole thing to present as a single system on chip for developers, preserving the benefits of Apple's unified memory and eliminating that need for costly niche software development. Such a machine could also offer PCI Express slots for adding cards and multiple options for storage drives. Of course, M1 does not yet offer ECC memory, at least as far as I'm aware, although there are handlers in the ARM64 code for it, and Apple is surely capable of doing it. At the end of the day, I'm basing my thoughts on what we know so far, what might be reasonable, make commercial sense, and be technically possible. But at the end of the day, Apple does have a habit of surprising us. Still, it's fun to imagine where they might be going with that new Mac Pro. And I'm sure not everyone will agree with me, so please let us know what you think in the comments. Please support the channel by subscribing, liking or disliking, and sharing this content. And I'll see you again soon for some more geekery.